the Congressional Insider Trading Bill, the Stock Act, beginning at 2 p.m. So a number of hours of debate ahead, but it looks like a final passage vote on that bill in the Senate late this afternoon. Follow that on C-SPAN 2. Now live to the House floor here on C-SPAN.
The House will be in order. Prayer will be offered by our chaplain, Father Conway.
Let us pray. We give you thanks, O God, for giving us another day. There have been many prayers this day rising to you from those engaged in the political discourse of this nation. We give you thanks for those who were able to gather at the National Prayer Breakfast and those across this land who joined their prayer intentions with the many who attended. Bless the members of this People's House now as they gather to do the legislative work they are called to do. May their prayers this day be authentic and heard by you, the living God. May their work be fruitful and beneficial to those whom you favor, the poor. And may all they do be done in humility and charity, knowing that they are all earthen vessels through whom your Spirit might shine forth. And finally, may all that is done this day be for your greater honor and glory. Amen.
The Chair has examined a journal of the last day's proceedings and announces to the House his approval thereof. Pursuant to Clause 1 of Rule 1, the journal stands approved. Pledge of allegiance today will be led by the gentleman from Minnesota, Mr. Ellison.
I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Chair will entertain up to 15 requests for 1-minute speeches on each side of the aisle. For what purpose does the gentleman from South Carolina rise? Without objection.
Mr. Speaker, the President's Blue Ribbon Commission, which was tasked with making recommendations for dealing with our country's nuclear waste, recently issued their findings. After conducting a 2-year study, the Commission discovered that measures must be taken to deal with nuclear waste currently in interim storage at 121 sites across the country. The editorial response by the Aiken Standard to this anemic, obvious conclusion is summarized by one word: duh. We have known for decades that this waste must be properly dealt with and discarded in a proper setting. The scientific community has determined that Yucca Mountain is the ideal location for a safe national repository. The President and the liberal-controlled Senate must quit playing political games and allow the Nuclear Regulatory Commission to finish analyzing the license permit. It's time to let science dictate policy, not politics. In conclusion, God bless our troops, and we will never forget September 11th and the global war on terrorism.
For what purpose does the gentlelady from New York rise? Without objection.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I stand with my good colleague from Western New York, Congressman Brian Higgins, united in opposition to the proposed elimination of the Postal Processing and Distribution Center in Buffalo and the 700 jobs of people that are currently employed there. Now, I understand the Postal Service is going through some tough times. They need to make some hard decisions. But up in our neck of the woods, 700 jobs is a very big deal. That's 700 families making mortgage payments, 700 families making their car payments, and 700 families that are able to make their tuition payments. But in addition to these individuals, businesses, seniors, and rural communities we represent would be adversely affected if this was to end. This would end the overnight delivery of first-class mail in the Buffalo region, impacting all the businesses that depend on this service. It would profoundly slow commerce, delay delivery of medication to our seniors, and impair communications for rural families who don't have Internet access. At a time when the Postal Service is struggling to retain business, they need to be creative and find new ways to garner more customers, not to end them. Mr. Speaker, I yield back the balance of my time. Thank you.
For what purpose does the gentleman from Ohio seek recognition?
Speaker,
Without objection.
Mr. Speaker, President Obama's activist EPA is at it again. This destructive agency, in advancing the administration's war on coal, is forcing the closure of 6 coal-fired power plants in 3 states. Just a few weeks ago, it was announced that the Muskingum River Power Plant in my district would have to close and eliminate over 100 jobs because of burdensome EPA regulations. Now, President Obama's war on coal is nothing new. With just one proposed rewrite of one rule, President Obama is putting tens of thousands of direct and indirect coal-related jobs at risk. Just over a week ago, the President stood in this chamber and told Americans that he wants to create jobs and grow the economy. But his policies do the exact opposite. Hard-working taxpayers across America deserve better. They deserve effective leadership that moves us forward rather than holding us back. With over 14 million Americans out of work, we can't afford more of the same failed policies from this administration. They are hurting America. And with that, I yield back the balance of my time.
The gentleman's time has expired. For what purpose does the gentlelady from Massachusetts seek recognition? Without objection.
Mr. Speaker, we are now in the month of February, and in less than 4 weeks, the 2-month payroll tax cut extension, which House Republicans begrudgingly agreed to, will expire. To avoid the same dramatic standoff that threatened a $1,400 tax increase for the average Massachusetts family, we must work together and adopt a year-long extension of this vital tax credit, rather than waiting till the last minute yet again. Failure to extend the payroll tax cut to the end of the year would not only severely impact already overstretched households around the country, but would also dramatically undermine our still fragile economic recovery. Families have already made their budgets for this year. They are counting on this extension to pay their bills, heat their homes, and meet other needs. Let's not let them down. Thank you, and I yield back my time.
The gentlelady yields back. For what purpose does the gentleman from Ohio seek recognition? Without objection.
Mr. Speaker, today our colleagues at the Education and Workforce Committee held a subcommittee hearing looking into the challenges facing the Pension Benefit Guaranty Corporation. Perhaps one of the greatest challenges facing the PBGC is transparency. The PBGC will not release even the most basic documents explaining the denial of the full earned pension benefits of the Delphi salary retirees. Perhaps it is because of the many conflicts of interest that existed between the Treasury Department and the PBGC. When these pensions were turned over to the PBGC, approximately 20,000 current and future salaried retirees were subjected to benefit cuts of up to 70%. Mr. Speaker, the hardworking taxpayers whose tax dollars were used to pay for the auto bailouts deserve to know who made these decisions to cut these pensions and why they were made. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. For what purpose does the gentleman from New York seek recognition? Without objection.
Mr. Speaker, on Sunday, tens of millions of Americans will gather with family and friends to watch the Super Bowl. Many from my Western New York community will be among them. Unfortunately, Western New York families do not always have the opportunity to watch our hometown team, the Buffalo Bills. The NFL's blackout rule prohibits the broadcast of a game in a team's home market if the game has not been sold out within 72 hours of the kickoff. Mr. Speaker, in Buffalo, this meant that the past season, almost half of the Bills games were blacked out. This is unacceptable. We have a strong and enthusiastic fan base, but with one of the largest football stadiums in the National Football League, Buffalo must sell 6,000 more tickets than the league's average to avoid a blackout. I have sent a letter to NFL Commissioner Goodell, along with my colleagues, Congresswoman Kathy Hochul, Congressman Ross, and Congresswoman Brown, asking for an end to this unfair policy. It's time for the league to update this regulation, taking into account factors like stadium and media market size, and most importantly, the tough financial situation millions of families across the nation find themselves in. I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman's time has expired. For what purpose does the gentleman from Florida seek recognition? Without objection.
Mr. Speaker, Washington is failing the American people. Our leaders need to be held to the highest standard, and that means obeying the same laws that everyone else has to live under. I'm pleased to report progress on an important bill that I co-sponsored. It's called the Stock Act. It would prohibit inside trading by any member of Congress. This bill is now starting to move in the Senate, and I intend to fight to ensure its swift passage. No one in government should profit from private information obtained through their position. Serving the people is a privilege, and it's an honor, not an opportunity for personal gain. And I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. For what purpose does the gentleman from Illinois seek recognition? Without objection.
Mr. Speaker, today is a sad day. In an effort to strip women of their right to choose, anti-choice groups have blocked access to life-saving cancer screenings. The nation's leading breast cancer charity, Susan G. Komen, announced it will no longer partner with Planned Parenthood, the nation's leading women's health care provider. This fight has pitted two of our nation's premier and important women's health care groups wrongly against each other. We, on either side of the Capitol and in these chambers, must remember that rhetoric has real-world consequences. For the health of women across America, this issue must be resolved quickly, and the collaborative relationship between these two great institutions restored. Until then, lives are at stake, sadly for political gain. Thank you, and I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. For what purpose does the gentleman from Pennsylvania seek recognition? Without objection.
Mr. Speaker, institutions across the country are facing an impossible choice. Do they continue in their mission to provide for their employees, or do they violate their conscience? When the Affordable Care Act passed, there was no thought in the minds of many Catholics that the law would eventually force them into such a terrible choice. In fact, my former colleague from Pennsylvania, Kathy Dahlkemper, recently came out and said, quote, "I would never voted for the final version of the bill if I expected the Obama administration to force Catholic hospitals and Catholic colleges and universities to pay for contraception," end quote. I might add, this rule that will go into effect on August 12 includes not only contraceptives but abortifacients, drugs like Ella and Plan B, as well as sterilization services. Catholic and other religious organizations that have cared for the sick and educated Americans of all religions since the founding of our republic. And they've done this because their conscience compels them to show their love to all mankind. Never before has the federal government compelled them to violate their conscience. To force them to violate their conscience is wrong.
The gentleman's time has expired. For what purpose does the gentleman from California seek recognition? Without objection.
Mr. Speaker, I rise to advocate an aggressive response to the housing crisis. Last year, 30% of California homeowners with mortgages were underwater. That's one of the highest rates in the country. But to improve our economy, we must fix the broken housing market. Large banks simply wait out short sales offers, which kills the process. Back home, I hear from people who are trying to secure short sales and have to wait for months or longer to get a decision from their lender. That's absolutely unacceptable. Banks need to treat people fairly, which is why I'm a co-sponsor of H.R. 1498, the Prompt Short Sale Decision Act. This is a bipartisan bill that requires lenders to make a decision within 45 days to approve or disapprove a short sale. This bill simply makes sure that prospective homeowners receive a decision from their banks in time to be usable. I ask my colleagues to join me in supporting this legislation so we can break up the housing market logjam. Thank you, and I yield back.
Gentleman's time has expired. For what purpose does the gentleman from California rise?
Speaker, I ask unanimous consent to address the House for 1 minute.
Without objection.
Mr. Speaker, if Congress does not act soon, 160 million Americans will see a tax increase at the end of the month. Working families in my district rely on the payroll tax cut to make their mortgage payments or put food on the table. We need to get to work right now on extending the payroll tax cut and unemployment insurance for a full year. 14 million Americans, I state 14 million Americans, are without jobs. Families need our help. They are hurting. But instead of working together to create jobs, Republicans continue to push a partisan agenda that further divides us. This week, we have yet another bill to repeal the health care. Let's stop these misguided bills. Let's get to work on the agenda that creates jobs. I say create jobs and straightens the middle class. We must work together. I yield back to balance my time.
The gentleman yields back. For what purpose does the gentlelady from Hawaii rise? Without objection.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Last week, we were in this chamber listening to the President deliver a State of the Union address, the blueprint for an America built to last. We took away different points from that speech. Many will speak to his initiatives which address American manufacturing, a new and innovative energy source, educating, creating a more skillful workforce. I took away that this blueprint for America to last will be successful because of its foundation, the foundation which is the people of this great nation. The President is putting his faith in the people. He's putting his faith in their values, uniquely American values. It is putting his faith in those values which created and motivated the creation of that middle class, the middle class which is the backbone of this great nation. That is why we will have an America built to last. Speaker, I yield back the balance of my time.
The gentlelady yields back. For what purpose does the gentleman from Minnesota rise?
Address the House for 1 minute.
Without objection.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, 1,300 Minnesota workers have been denied their basic and most fundamental right to work and support their families. That's right. Yesterday marked the 6-month anniversary of workers at American Crystal Sugar Factory in Moorhead being locked out. Locked out. Many of these people have worked for the factory their whole lives. Their parents worked there, Mr. Speaker, and their grandparents worked there too. These workers have gone to work and have gone to bat for the company. These workers, Mr. Speaker, stood shoulder to shoulder with the company to fight for a better sugar program in the Farm Bill, just because that's how dedicated they are. But what have they got in return? They've gotten locked out. They're not on strike. They're locked out because they will not accept an unfair take-it-or-leave-it contract. These workers even vowed not to strike because they know how important their work is, but they have been locked out even though they have agreed to a no-strike guarantee. It's wrong, Mr. Speaker. These 1,300 folks deserve better from this company, and I think the time is now for the company to negotiate.
The gentleman's time has expired. For what purpose does the gentleman from Oregon seek recognition? Without objection.
Stand. Mr. Speaker, at this moment, the House Transportation and Infrastructure Committee is working on what is arguably the worst transportation bill in the history of Congress, just when we need the best. It's not just wrong size, too little resources from the wrong sources. It fails to protect the integrity of the trust fund, inviting opposition from budget hawks. It reverses 20 years of transportation reform by attacking the cheapest way to develop highway capacity in most communities, transit and cycling. It even eliminates the Safe Routes to School program for our children. I hope my staff heard wrong that the committee chair will deny participation to anybody who asks for a vote on a provision, not just in committee, but will not even be able to offer an amendment on the floor. Let's get back to the bipartisan tradition to have infrastructure that America needs.
The gentleman's time has expired. For what purpose does the gentleman from Georgia seek recognition? Without objection.
Mr. Speaker, I rise today to ask this Tea Party Republican majority to do something to create jobs. Last week, the President presented a positive plan to create jobs, but all the American people hear from the Tea Party Republican Party is the same old no-jobs agenda from this no-show Republican Congress. The economy is improving, but there are still 14 million Americans without jobs, yet the Republican Congress hardly even shows up for work. Congress met only 6 days of the month of January. 6 days in 1 month. We need to come to work and pass President Obama's jobs plan, level the playing field, force the rich to pay their fair share of our nation's debt, and put an end to rewarding businesses that ship jobs overseas. Thank you, and I yield back.
Purpose does the gentlelady from California seek recognition? Without objection.
Mr. Speaker, My constituents and I, for us, the work here in Congress is about making laws that make lives better. And last week, our President came to this chamber and laid out a blueprint to build an America that lasts. That blueprint focuses on manufacturing, education, worker training, clean energy, and ensuring that every American plays by the same set of rules and pays their fair share. By building from the ground up, by focusing on working people, we can build an economy that lasts. My friends on the other side offer a different path. It's a top-down approach with big tax breaks for the wealthy and subsidies for big oil at the expense of new technology and innovators. But we know what happens when you use all of your resources and materials at the top of the building. It topples over. Thank you. I yield back my time.
Gentlelady yields back. For what purpose does the gentleman from Kansas seek recognition? Without objection.
Mr. Speaker, I rise today to honor the brave men and women who served and sacrificed in World War I. 2014 will be the centennial anniversary of the Great War, and it's my hope that a grateful nation will come together to pay tribute to the heroes who fought for liberty and freedom almost 100 years ago. I urge my colleagues to support the Frank Buckles World War I Memorial Act, which would establish a commission to ensure a proper national observance of this historic occasion. Kansas City, which has a long tradition dating back to 1921 of honoring World War I and its legacy, is home to the outstanding National World War I Museum. I ask my colleagues to join in our support of designating this museum the National World War I Memorial. It's my hope that over the next 2 years we can come together and recognize the ideals and values that our country's bravest so exemplified in the First World War and that we continue to uphold today. I yield back.
The gentleman yields back. For what purpose does the gentlelady from Maine seek recognition? Without objection.
Mr. Speaker, in my state of Maine, there are thousands of couples in loving, committed relationship. They share homes and they raise children together. They remain committed to each other through the ups and downs of life. But because they are same-sex couples, they are denied the right to honor their love and commitment to each other through marriage. This fall, Maine will have a chance to change that and to join a growing list of states around the country that are setting aside discrimination and granting all couples the same right to get married. We've made progress here in Congress on ending discriminatory practices like Don't Ask, Don't Tell, but it will be up to us in Maine to bring marriage equality to our state. This is an issue of basic human rights and equal treatment under the law, and I am confident we'll do the right thing. I yield back the balance of my time.
The gentlelady yields back. For what purpose does the gentleman from Delaware seek recognition? Without objection.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise today to talk about the prescription drug shortage crisis we have today in America. Across the country, patients are being forced to go without the critical medications they need to battle diseases and stay healthy. This crisis is hitting cancer patients especially hard, with serious shortages of chemotherapy drugs. That's why this week I introduced the Drug Shortage Prevention Act with Representative Larry Bucshon, my Republican colleague from Indiana. Our bill helps FDA work with drug producers and distributors to fix some of the regulatory problems that are causing these shortages. It also improves communication so doctors and patients have the information they need to make smart treatment decisions. This is not a partisan issue. Drug shortages affect all of us, and so I urge my colleagues to quickly pass this bipartisan legislation. When a family gets hit with a diagnosis like cancer, they have enough things to worry about. Running out of chemo drugs should not be one of those things. Thank you. I yield back.
Gentleman's time has expired. For what purpose does the gentleman from Connecticut seek recognition? Without objection.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise this morning to offer my support for the Stock Act, a bill that would make it illegal for members of Congress to trade securities on inside information, a restriction that applies to pretty much everybody else. I'm a proud co-sponsor of that act, but only partly proud. I'm frankly embarrassed that legislation is necessary to prohibit insider trading by all of us. I urge the Republican leadership to bring that bill to the floor now. Don't make us go through petitions and this and that and the other thing. Let's bring it to the floor now, and I urge the other body, the United States Senate, to move it now. My understanding is that senators are attaching constitutional amendments and other irrelevant provisions to a bill that should be a no-brainer. If we can't get this done, we will have earned the scorn of the American people. Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I yield back the balance of my time.
The gentleman yields back. The chair lays before the House the following communication.
The Honorable the Speaker, House of Representatives, sir. Pursuant to the permission granted in Clause 2H of Rule 2 of the Rules of the U.S. House of Representatives, the clerk received the following message from the Secretary of the Senate on February 2, 2012 at 9:40 a.m. that the Senate passed Senate 1296, that the Senate passed without amendment H.R. 588. With best wishes, I am, signed sincerely, Karen L. Haas.
Communication is received. For what purpose does the gentleman from Georgia seek recognition?
Mr. Speaker, by direction of the Committee on Rules, I call up House Resolution 534 and ask for its immediate consideration.
The clerk will report the resolution.
House Calendar Number 108, House Resolution 534, resolved that upon adoption of this resolution, it shall be in order to consider in the House the bill H.R. 3578 to amend the Balanced Budget and Emergency Deficit Control Act of 1985 to reform the budget baseline. All points of order against consideration of the bill are waived. In lieu of the amendment in the nature of a substitute recommended by the Committee on the Budget now printed in the bill, an amendment in the nature of a substitute consisting of the text of the Rules Committee print 112-9, dated January 25, 2012, shall be considered as adopted. The bill as amended shall be considered as read. All points of order against the provisions in the bill as amended are waived. The previous question shall be considered as ordered on the bill as amended and on any further amendment thereto to final passage without intervening motion except one. 1 hour of debate equally divided and controlled by the chair and ranking minority member of the Committee on the Budget. 2, the further amendment printed in Part A of the report of the Committee on Rules accompanying this resolution, if offered by Representative Jackson Lee of Texas or her designee, which shall be in order without intervention of any point of order, shall be considered as read, shall be debatable for 10 minutes, equally divided and controlled by the proponent and an opponent, and shall not be subject to a demand for division of the question. And 3, one motion to recommit with or without instructions. Section 2. At any time after the adoption of this resolution, the Speaker may, pursuant to Clause 2B of Rule 18, declare the House resolved into the Committee of the Whole House on the State of the Union for consideration of the bill H.R. 3582 to amend the Congressional Budget Act of 1974 to provide for macroeconomic analysis of the impact of legislation. The first reading of the bill shall be dispensed with. All points of order against consideration of the bill are waived. General debate shall be confined to the bill and shall not exceed 1 hour, equally divided and controlled by the chair and ranking minority member of the Committee on the Budget. After general debate, the bill shall be considered for amendment under the 5-minute rule. In lieu of the amendment in the nature of a substitute recommended by the Committee on the Budget now printed in the bill, it shall be in order to consider as an original bill for the purpose of amendment under the 5-minute rule an amendment in the nature of a substitute consisting of the text of the Rules Committee print 112-10, dated January 25, 2012. That amendment in the nature of a substitute shall be considered as read. All points of order against that amendment in the nature of a substitute are waived. No amendment to that amendment in the nature of a substitute shall be in order except those printed in Part B of the report of the Committee on Rules accompanying this resolution. Each such amendment may be offered only in the order printed in the report, may be offered only by a member designated in the report, shall be considered as read, shall be debatable for the time specified in the report, equally divided and controlled by the proponent and an opponent, shall not be subject to amendment, and shall not be subject to a demand for division of the question in the House or in the Committee of the Whole. All points of order against such amendments are waived. At the conclusion of consideration of the bill for amendment, the committee shall rise and report the bill to the House with such amendments as may have been adopted. Any member may demand a separate vote in the House on any amendment adopted in the Committee of the Whole to the bill or to the amendment in the nature of a substitute made in order as original text. The previous question shall be considered as ordered on the bill and amendments thereto to final passage without intervening motion except one motion to recommit with or without instructions.
The gentleman from Georgia is recognized for 1 hour.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm happy to be down here with you today. And for the purpose of debate only, I'd like to yield the customary 30 minutes to my good friend from Florida, Mr. Hastings. And I'd like to ask unanimous consent, Mr. Speaker, that all members have 5 legislative days to revise and extend their remarks.
Without objection.
Mr. Speaker, House Resolution 534, this rule before us today, brings the first of 2 Budget Committee reform bills to the floor. As the Speaker is very familiar, the Budget Committee has been working hard, not just this year, but last year as well, to put together an agenda to make the budget more accessible to the American people, to make budgeting in Washington, D.C. look more like budgeting back home around the kitchen table. We have the first of those 2 reform bills coming to the floor today with the passage of this rule. This rule is a structured rule, Mr. Speaker, that brings H.R. 3578, the Baseline Reform Act, and H.R. 3582, the Pro-Growth Budgeting Act, to the floor. We all know it's been 1,000 days, Mr. Speaker, over 1,000 days, since the Senate has produced a budget. But here in the House, not only did we produce a budget last year on time, we will produce a budget this year on time, and we will produce another budget, as we did last year, that the American people can be proud of. Knowing that it's a given the American people are going to be proud of that work product, Mr. Speaker, because you and I will ensure it, the question is, will folks be able to understand it? I confess, as a freshman member on the Budget Committee, Mr. Speaker, it's not always easy to do. The President's going to submit his budget to us in a couple of weeks. I think it was going to be next week. I think he's put it off for another week. I'm looking forward to seeing it when it finally arrives. But my recollection and expectation is going to be it's going to be more than 12 inches tall. More than 12 inches tall, not because the President's doing anything wrong, but because that's the level of detail and sophistication it takes to produce a budget for the United States of America. So what can we do to make this budget easier to understand? What can we do to make this budget more like the budgeting that goes on around the kitchen table? The Baseline Reform Act, first bill that this rule would bring to the floor, does this, Mr. Speaker. It eliminates the assumption that the CBO makes today that every Congress is going to spend more next year than the previous Congress. Now, there are, as a function of law, Mr. Speaker, some areas of the budget that do, in fact, go up. We know, for example, that 10,000 new Americans every day apply for Social Security and Medicare. 10,000 new baby boomers every day apply for Social Security and Medicare. We calculate that in the law. It exists in statute today to say, let's go ahead and raise that spending level based on those new folks accessing the system. But there's over $1 trillion in spending, Mr. Speaker, for which there is no law that says it's going to go up next year and the year after that and the year after that, and yet the Congressional Budget Office today, when they chart out the budget for the United States of America, assumes that that increase is going to take place. Well, I'm tremendously proud, Mr. Speaker, that at least in my short time here, I've seen just the opposite. Every single bill that this body has brought to the floor and sent to the President has reduced spending. Spending was $1.091 trillion in 2010. We reduced it to $1.050 trillion in 2011. Reduced it again to $1.043 trillion for 2012. That's the trend that my constituents want back home, Mr. Speaker, and I think the trend that America deserves. But more importantly, we've all been involved in those conversations back home where folks say, when is a cut not really a cut? When's an increase not really an increase? Only here in Washington, Mr. Speaker, can we spend $10 last year and $12 next year and call that a budget cut. Only here. The Baseline Reform Act eliminates that. The Pro-Growth Budgeting Act, the second bill that this rule would bring to the floor, adds a new bit of information to the Congressional Budget Office baseline. It's the same information that President Obama asked for in his stimulus bill to say when we spend this $800 billion, what impact is that going to have? We know it's going to be $800 billion out the door. We know we're never going to get that money back. We know that's going to be money that we have to borrow from foreign lands. But what do we get for that $800 billion? And he asked the Congressional Budget Office to score it that way, and they did. What the Pro-Growth Budgeting Act says is, let's add that feature for every future bill. On the tax side of the ledger, what happens, Mr. Speaker, when we cut taxes? We know that means less revenue comes in from that one tax, but what does it mean for the economy at the whole? We see it over and over again. When we have taxes at their highest, sometimes our tax receipts are at their lowest. When we have tax rates at their lowest, sometimes our tax receipts are at their highest. The Congressional Budget Office can give us that information, and this bill makes it possible for them to do that. So, Mr. Speaker, I'm tremendously proud and tremendously enthusiastic about not only the rule, but the two underlying bills, and I look forward to that discussion, not just on the rule with my friend Mr. Hastings, but with the Budget Committee later on this afternoon. I reserve the balance of my time.
The gentleman reserves the balance of his time. The gentleman from Florida is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, thank you very much. I yield myself such time as I may consume.
The gentleman's recognized.
I thank my good friend from Georgia for yielding me the time to go forward with discussion of this particular rule. The rule provides for consideration of both H.R. 3578, which is referred to as the Baseline Reform Act, and H.R. 3582, the Pro-Growth Budgeting Act. Both of these bills, in my opinion, impose convoluted new rules on an already complicated budget process and attempt to enshrine the majority's ideology into what is supposed to be an objective analysis. What my friends on the Republican side are presenting as common sense reforms are actually, in my opinion, nonsense reforms. These budget process changes are mere gimmicks to defend the elimination of spending on essential government services and to dress up tax cuts for those in our society who are well off in the phony disguise of benefiting average Americans. These changes tie Congress and the Congressional Budget Office up in knots in an effort to prove that conservative ideology about taxes and spending is going to grow our nation's economy, not creating more jobs, not stimulating demand, not investing in infrastructure or education or any of the many endeavors that are critical to improving the lives of all Americans. Rather, what my friends, the Republicans, are trying to do is, in my opinion, create a Frankenstein budget process. And a procedure here, add a little bit of a procedure, sever a rule over there, zap it with some electricity or hyperbole, and now you have a budget process that proves tax cuts for the wealthiest among us are the only way to grow our economy. But guess what? It still ain't human, and it certainly isn't humane. For the Baseline Reform Act, Mr. Speaker, Republicans propose that the Congressional Budget Office not include annual inflation when making their budget estimates. When I was a child, 10 and 11 years old, we didn't get radio programs very much, but we got radio programs on Saturday. And one of the programs that I enjoyed so much as a little boy, sitting on the rug in the living room listening to, was Let's Pretend. And I never did know then that I would be here in this august institution sitting around with people who are pretending in the budget process that inflation doesn't exist when they're making budget estimates. I talked yesterday, and one of my friends on the Rules Committee had been down in Florida and knew when I told him that I had a major water issue at my home in Florida. And so for the last 2 or 3 months, my water bill has been exorbitant, and I couldn't figure out why. And ultimately, this morning, I learned for the first time that there's a substantial leak inside the house, and so the plumbers are there. I'm already out more than $1,000, and later on I'm going to be voting about my salary. Yesterday I voted about the cost of living for federal employees, and I think we do them a terrible disservice by disallowing them the kinds of increases that take into consideration the exact same kind of thing that I and other members of this House and people throughout this nation are experiencing when it comes to their personal undertakings. We've been without an increase here, and yes, this nation is in serious trouble, and the people that we tend to attack are the people that are at the lowest end of the scale, and the middle-class people, the police officers, the firefighters, the school teachers, who make $35, $40, 1 or 2 of them luckily make $60,000 a year, and what we wind up doing is taking them to task. They have the same plumbing problems that I do. There is inflation, and you can't do a budget without contemplating it, but if you wish to pretend, then I guess that's what we will do, is play let's pretend. This seems like a rather mundane technical change, but it isn't. I'd be pleased to support this, Mr. Speaker, because it means that in making my own personal budget or projections, I could have just simply ignored the fact that costs for everyday items, and I don't know a single thing that I've bought in the last 3 years that has gone down in price. I just simply ignore the fact that costs for everyday items and activities tend to go up every year, indeed every month. And around this place, if you're looking at the local gas stations, every day, every week. I can just assume that I'm paying today, if I wanted to, I guess, and keep paying 10 years from now and still expect the exact same amount of goods and services. But of course, we all know that that isn't true. Simply wishing away or pretending that inflation away won't make it so. Fuzzy math does not equal fiscal responsibility. By eliminating inflation adjustments from discretionary spending projections, my friends, the Republicans are actually just reducing the funding for a federal program. Since the dollar amount would stay the same every year, the amount of services that could be covered would decrease. I this morning had the good fortune of having a fine group of safety patrol students from Pleasant City Elementary School in Palm Beach County in West Palm Beach in the office, and I was talking with them about the fact that I would be here discussing the budget and how everything affects their lives as well as the lives of all American citizens around this country. And if we were to allow this budget process to take place, all we will have is a continuing decrease over the long term, and things that I may wish for those children at Pleasant City Elementary School or at Cove Elementary. Their counselor was here, and we were discussing the number of teachers that have been laid off and the number of music programs that no longer exist. So let's just pretend that they don't cost but the same thing at one time, and you'll find over the long haul that you'll get these decreases, and that will result in massive decreases in essential services like fire services and police services and school teachers that millions, indeed all Americans, rely on. This technical change, then, is actually a backdoor effort to slowly starve necessary government programs rather than be upfront about which programs Republicans want to eliminate. The celebrated conservative Grover Norquist made it very clear. H.R. 3578 says that every year, every program and agency should be assumed to get smaller and smaller automatically. I refer to Mr. Norquist as an ideologue. He said, "I'm not in favor of abolishing government," and I'm quoting him, "I just want to shrink it down to the size where we can drown it in a bathtub." I somehow or another am at odds with that kind of thinking when we're about the business of having more people, as I explained, to the children that are in the category of the neediest, and here we are protecting the greediest in our society. This technical change, then, is actually a backdoor effort to slowly starve necessary government programs rather than be upfront about which programs Republicans want to eliminate. They would rather put sneaky rules into place to guarantee the outcome they want without having to have an open debate. That's the kind of budget process that only Igor, the Frankenstein monster, could love. Through the Pro-Growth Budgeting Act, Mr. Speaker, Republicans want to introduce dynamic scoring to the CBO's projection process. Once again, this seems like a minor technical change, but when you look closely, you see that this is an effort to zap electricity into Igor the monster budget that is tax cuts in the final analysis for those of us in the society that are better off and the wealthier even among that class. Under this bill, the CBO's analysis are tweaked so that tax cuts for the wealthy seem like they grow the economy, while actual investments in the needs of everyday Americans do not. Republicans make it easier to cut taxes for those of us that are well off and those of us that are rich than to build bridges and schools for the rest of us. This bill specifically instructs the CBO to ignore the positive economic effects that will come about from investment in things like infrastructure and education, as if spending on things that Americans want and need won't boost the economy, they would have us pretend. The CBO has already projected that extending the Bush tax cuts for the wealthiest among us would actually reduce growth in the long run. But rather than face the facts, Republicans simply want to change the rules so that this analysis is turned upside down. My friends on the Republican side have been so concerned about building actual bridges to nowhere, they've turned the budget process into its own kind of bridge to nowhere, rather than using the budget process to lead this country into a new era of economic growth. My friends on the other side of the aisle want to cut taxes for very wealthy people, cut programs for everyone else, and then feel like they've set this country on the right track. This is no way to run an economy, no way to run a budget process, and no way to stick up for millions of struggling Americans who need us to focus on improving the economy. Mr. Speaker, I reserve the balance of my time.
The gentleman reserves the balance of his time. The gentleman from Georgia is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I yield myself such time as I may consume to just really take a moment to think about the doublespeak here in Washington, D.C. That's been the biggest adjustment since having the great privilege of being a member in this U.S. House of Representatives. What my friend from Florida, I know very genuinely, calls sneaky, I call common sense. You know, today in the budget, Mr. Speaker, today in the budget, the CBO doesn't have to follow the law for about a quarter of all federal government spending. When they're scoring Medicare and Medicaid, they follow the law to say what's Medicare and Medicaid going to do over the next 10 years. When they're scoring discretionary spending, however, they just guess. They just guess. That's what the process is today. Just guess at what future Congresses are going to be. What are those future Congresses going to do? Now, I tell you, that's an exercise in folly. You couldn't possibly get it right. That's what CBO director told us yesterday, that it's a challenge to put these numbers together. And the more they have to guess, the more inaccurate their result becomes. So what are these two bills?
Colleague, yield just on one point.
I'd be happy to yield,
on
my
that
friend.
guessing, then why are we mandating 40 years? How in the world are we going to guess, have them predict what 40 years are going to look like?
I thank my friend for asking and reclaiming my time. What those 40 years are 40 years of congressionally mandated action. Right? That's what's so different here, Mr. Speaker. There are things that Congress speaks to and things about which Congress is silent. And for reasons unbeknownst to me or the families back home in my district, what this Congress has said, this body that's been instilled with the power of all of our voters back home, we've said we abdicate it. CBO, just guess. You know, when you and I were working together last summer on the Budget Control Act, we went exactly the opposite route. As you know, Mr. Speaker, in the Budget Control Act, we said, don't guess about what's going to happen next year. We're putting a number in statute for spending. And don't guess about what's going to happen 2 years down the road for that. We're putting a number in statute. And don't guess about another year down the road for that, because we are putting a number in statute. Look at that, Mr. Speaker. What we've chosen to do, instead of just guessing about the country's future, is to do what the American people sent us here to do, and that's legislate on the country's future. Only here can you spend $10 this year, $12 next year, and call that a cut. I don't get it. I don't get it, and folks back home don't get it. Far from being gimmickry, this is unifying the federal budget process with what that budget process is for millions of families back home around the dinner table. And to be clear about the Pro-Growth Budgeting Act, Mr. Speaker, because I want to make sure that my friend from Florida and I are working on the same information, the Pro-Growth Budgeting Act does not change the CBO baseline process at all. Not at all. The same score that CBO would have done for legislation yesterday, they're going to do that same score for legislation tomorrow if the Pro-Growth Budgeting Act becomes law. What will be different is, and I love this about the direction of this Congress, Mr. Speaker, the difference will be the American people will have a new piece of information to add to the old baseline. A new piece of information. During the discussion yesterday with the Congressional Budget Office, we got the CBO baseline, but we also got additional information. What would happen if you extended tax cuts? What would happen if you did alternative things called the alternative baseline? The Pro-Growth Budgeting Act says, let's build on that. Because in these times, we can't afford to have any stone unturned for economic growth for this country, and we certainly can't afford to continue, as this town has done far too long, if we're candid with ourselves, far too long, kept the American people in the dark about federal budgeting issues. These two bills, again, these are just the first of 10 bills that will be coming to this floor, Mr. Speaker, but these two bills shine a spotlight on the federal budget process in ways that we can all be proud. And I reserve my time so I can discuss that even further later on, Mr. Speaker. Thank you.
The gentleman reserves the balance of his time. The gentleman from Florida.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I'm very pleased to yield 5 minutes to my good friend, the gentleman from New Jersey, Mr. Andrews.
The gentleman from New Jersey is recognized for 5 minutes. Without objection.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I thank my friend for yielding. For a long time, Americans have believed if you work hard every day and play by the rules, you'll be able to earn enough to own a home and educate your children and retire with some dignity. It's the American dream. Precious numbers of, or large numbers of people, rather, are now disbelieving in that because it's not really happening in their lives. They're working as hard as they can, but they seem to go backwards, not forwards, when they work so hard. You can't reignite the American dream unless you reignite the middle class. And you can't reignite the middle class unless you reignite small business. Small businesses in this country create about 2 out of every 3 jobs created in the country. In the last 20 years, 80% of the new jobs have been created by businesses that are younger than a year old. So new small businesses are the key to getting things done. Now, if you talk to small business people around the country, as we have in our districts, here's what they'll tell you. Their number one concern these days is they don't have enough customers. There's not enough people eating in their restaurants or buying goods in their stores or buying the manufactured goods that they do or buying the software code that they write. They need more customers. So 147 days ago, the President of the United States came to this chamber and said we ought to do 4 things to stimulate customers for those small businesses and grow the middle class. First, he said, we should repair our nation's aging bridges and railroads and highways and put construction workers back to work and building schools in the process. The Congress has never voted on that proposal. Second thing the President said is when a small business hires people, their taxes should be cut. So a tax cut for small businesses that hire Americans. The Congress has never voted on that proposal. Third thing that he said is because of the economic distress of our country, cities and counties and states are laying off police officers, firefighters, teachers, which hurts public safety and hurts education, but it also hurts businesses because police officers and firefighters and teachers without a paycheck aren't going to be buying things in the stores or eating in the restaurants or spending their money. So the President said, let's take some money and help states and localities rehire and put those teachers back in the classroom and put those firefighters back on the apparatus and put those cops back on the beat. We've never voted on that proposal. And finally, the President said, look, we cut Social Security taxes, we cut the payroll tax for really all working Americans in 2010, at the end of 2010. And that tax cut's about to expire, and if we let it expire, it'll be about a $1,000 tax increase for middle-class Americans, which will not only hurt those families, but will hurt the economy by draining their purchasing power from the economy. So let's extend that tax cut. We did manage to do that for 2 months, and that's about to expire now in 27 days. We'll be back at that by the end of the month. Now, if that's the urgent agenda for the country, what are we doing today? What we're doing today is passing a change in budget rules that essentially says the following. If you're really optimistic about what a tax cut might do to the economy, you can assume that optimism for purposes of keeping score in the budget. This is like a family sitting down and planning its budget at the beginning of the year and saying, I think we're both going to get a raise this year. You're a teacher, I'm a truck driver, I think we're both going to get a 5 or 10% raise, so let's plan the family budget based on that. I think scarcely any of the constituents who send us here would ever draft their family budget in that way. If this rule goes through, that's the way we'll draft the federal budget. It has become an article of faith, religious orthodoxy on the Republican side, that tax cuts produce higher revenues. At best, the evidence is ambiguous. Most of the time it doesn't. Maybe sometimes it does. But I think we should respect the Establishment Clause of the Constitution and separate church and state. If the Republican religion is that tax cuts always produce more revenue, I don't think we should write that religion into the law of the country, because it's not always right. Now, beyond that, if we go home to our constituents, our middle-class families, our businesses, and say, what would you, I would ask for one more minute. And they say, what did you do this week? Did you get me bills that would bring more customers in? Did you help me grow more jobs? And here's what we did. We adjusted the CBO baseline for the consideration of future revenue policies of the United States. This is a very interesting graduate school debate. Maybe someday, if we were flush with cash again, it would be a good policy debate. It is the wrong bill at the wrong time, and it shouldn't be on the House floor. Let's at least put up for a vote the 4 specific ideas brought to this chamber by the President of the United States
to regrow the middle class and put Americans back to work. And when we've done the real job we were sent here to do, then we can get to the graduate school seminar on congressional budgeting. I yield back the balance of my time.
The gentleman yields back the balance of his time. The gentleman from Florida reserves the balance of his time, which is 11 minutes. And the gentleman from Georgia, who has 20½ minutes, is recognized.
I thank the Speaker, and I've always enjoyed listening to my friend from New Jersey because inevitably I agree with about the first 6 things he says. All of the facts on which he bases his conclusions, I agree on. And I just reach a completely different set of conclusions. My friend said that one of the challenges we have in America is that folks think they're working as hard as they can, but they're going backwards instead of forwards. I get that in my district, too. I think the gentleman is absolutely right, and hope is so powerful in this country. When we lose that hope, we really get ourselves in a world of hurt. And I think the gentleman's absolutely right. The gentleman says we can't get the economy back on track unless we get our small businesses moving again. Gentleman, absolutely right. I know it to be true. I see it in my chambers of commerce, Mr. Speaker. But what then? Agreeing that the American people are working as hard as they can and they feel like they're going backwards. Agreeing that the small business community is working as hard as it can, but it can't find enough consumers. What's the answer? My friend from New Jersey laid out, as my president did, 4 giant spending initiatives with borrowed money that he believes if only the federal government would get involved in, we could regenerate those 2 needy areas. And my constituents tell me exactly the opposite, Mr. Speaker. My constituents say, Rob, if only the federal government were not involved in my life, if only the federal government were not borrowing all of this money, if only the federal government would leave us alone and let us succeed. The government is not the solution. They tell me the government is the problem. These 2 bills today, sadly, I again agree with my friend, do nothing to stop the government from being a problem. And in fairness, the Budget Committee is not in that business. The Budget Committee is in the planning of the financial future business. We need the authorizing committees to actually shrink the size and scope of government. But what these 2 bills do, and it troubles me, candidly, it troubles me that it's even an area of debate. What these 2 bills do are one thing and one thing only, and that's provide additional arrows in the quiver of information that we provide to the American people about the American fiscal situation. And in days like today, Mr. Speaker, with challenges like we have today, the American people deserve the truth. It's not always easy to say it, but we owe it to them to say it, and these 2 bills move us in that direction. I'd be happy to yield.